At this point, we're ready to go into some details on how to create the civil cell, and I know that I kind of went through this in an earlier video, but there's a couple of extra details I want to point out when we get into Project Explorer and some of the options. We're going to go back and start the same command. And just information here, essentially you want to create your civil cells in a dgnlib, and we've been working at a dgn file. I could, essentially rename this to a dgnlib file, but you want them in a dgnlib. Ultimately, when you're done, you can work the whole time in a dgnlib. That's fine as well. So I'm going to pretend like that I'm in a dgnlib, and we're going to give it a name, and I'm just going to call this T intersection like before. And when it asks you for the reference, just as a reminder, we're going to go in and type in, something here. So side road baseline or whatever, side road center line, I don't care. Tab out, and then accept the placement reference, not the construction reference, the placement reference. And then it says for the next reference, so I'm going to go type in my new name here. So through road EP, and I'm going to pick my next placement reference. And now everything should highlight in terms of your geometry, and it does. So now we're going to reset. Now what this one's asking for is optional references. Let's say, for example, that you know that your edge of pavement here is offset from your construction reference at 12 feet, but maybe instead you wanted it to follow a meandering, tapering edge of pavement. You can identify those blue lines also as an optional reference, and so ultimately the 12-foot offset would be overrode by the optional reference you assign it to. Effectively, it's the same thing as assigning a point control to geometry once it's placed, and just kind of a shortcut. So for this, we're going to reset, and then we're going to accept. And now that civil cell is created. Now, a couple of things we need to do in the Project Explorer. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock that out, and I'm also going to lock out element information. There's a couple of important things here that we need to make sure that we take care of. I'm going to expand under the Civil Model tab, the civil cell we created. The first thing I want to do is expand references and make sure that those names took, that I got my tabs and typing and all that sequence in there, and make sure that they're there, and if they're not, you need to retype them. And if you expand down on here, you'll see these names, and when you highlight that particular line, for example, it shows you which one you're talking about. Now, if I'm a user and I see a line name called DNC19, I'm not going to have any idea what that means. I was very I don't know what the word is. I did not pay any attention to naming my line work as I created it. That is not what you want to do. Now, you can always go in to each of these lines and give them a meaningful name. For example, I could come over here and select this and go to properties, and I have the name right there, and I can name it later. But please put the effort into giving, like this one would be side road placement reference. Okay, would be a good name for that one instead of DNC19. Okay, through road placement reference. Just make sure that these names are meaningful as a polishing entry there. So make sure your references. These are the prompts. This is what the user would be prompted. So if the prompt name is not right, then you can change that prompt name right here. Okay, that's under references. Optional references we didn't have, so they'll be empty. Then you have something here called dependent elements, and there's a couple of, one thing in particular I want to point out here is you can only do this for one terrain model. And sometimes you might have multiple terrain models in a civil cell, but for one terrain model you can select it, and see how it's kind of shown here with 3 different layers. And so each of these icons mean something. But if I right click on that one, this is where I tell it, I want that terrain model, to be something that can clip my main corridor. Now you're going to say, well, what about the sidewalk and the fill slopes? Wouldn't that clip the main corridor? Well, what it does is it takes the terrain model and everything that is attached to the edges of it and says you are all to clip. And so if I want that intersection to be a clipping, I want it to be added as a clipping reference to the main corridor, or I want to prompt the user for a corridor to be clipped by the civil cell I am about to place, then you select one terrain, which is usually your pavement terrain, and you say I want to add that as a corridor clipping boundary. And when I do that, what that does is that populates down here the category under corridor clipping boundary, and you'll see that same terrain is listed there. Okay, so that's one thing to make sure and set. The other thing is when you highlight the civil cell, you need to make sure that valid for placement says yes. That means it is everything in there is okay. You haven't broken rules. There's not something wrong. If that says no, you're going to need to drop the civil cell and basically recreate it because something you've done in there it doesn't like. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're on a particular project and you've told it to target a point control with a specific name. Well, you're probably going to invalidate the ability for that civil cell to be placed anywhere else. Okay, so make sure that's set to yes. So that's important to check. The other thing is on your references, in particular, actually your dependent elements, on your surface template, you need to make sure and set this to true. What this is for is when we place that surface template below the pavement top, remember we gave it a depth? If you set create linear features to true on top of that surface template, it'll make those three-dimensional break lines show up in the model. If you don't set that to true, they won't be available. So I don't understand why you would never not have it set to true, but unfortunately the default is false. Now we just added this ability in the last service pack that we released, so this is a fairly new thing that we've put in there. But on your mesh template, make sure the create linear feature is set to true. Okay? The last thing I want to say here is on the creation of these civil cells is at the step where we went and applied this surface template to the terrain, at that point it is going to take your active microstation symbology associated with that surface template and write something hidden only that the program understands. But let's say you had default as your active level and then you go to apply that surface template, you're going to write something then to default level. And so just to show you, our default here was Z construction, and if I go back to examine this particular template, and if I come in here and I want to look at, in element information, I need to expand that. That's what I wanted. Notice on here that it has written to the active microstation symbology. And so just be very aware of that. When you go to apply the surface template, I would typically set your active microstation symbology to some, do not construct or Z construction or something that makes sense, that it's non-plot level or whatever, so that when it needs to use that level to create that surface template, that it is on a level that's not going to cause your users heartache. In other words, your default level shouldn't be proposed geometry, for example. Okay? So just be aware of that as well. Okay, that concludes the creation of the civil cell. In the next video, we're going to go through the highlights of a presentation about civil cells to just touch on a couple of other points that I want to stress, and we'll do that fairly quickly. And then the last video will be the actual creation of a driveway civil cell, in which I would encourage you to actually follow along at your computer with the steps and reproduce that driveway civil cell at the best of your ability, just using a data set of your own. All you really need to do is to start with a terrain model or a 10 file and import that 10, and then you can make a driveway civil cell. So our next video, again, we'll go through a presentation, and then the last one will be a driveway design.